Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Bava, Daf Yud, and we're starting at the very top of the page, though the truth is that we're really in the midst of a mini sugya. If you'll recall from yesterday, there were a number of comments in the name of Ula, who was quoting from Rabbi Lazar, and really has nothing to do with our Masech at all. And the last case that we were dealing with was 6-7 lines from the bottom, that if I owe you money, you are allowed to collect from my avadim. And then the Gemara had said, what about from the Yasomim? Let's say the avadim go from me to my orphans, my children, that they take them. If the Eved is from there, you're allowed to collect. And in front of Rabbi Lazar, he said, no, you're not allowed to, only from that person. That's what he said in front of Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman asked Ula, and Ula said no about the Yasomim. This is where we pick up on the very top line of Yud Beis Mud Aleph. Lebasar denafak, after, Rashi highlights that after Rav Nachman walked out, Ula turned around and said, really what I told Rav Nachman wasn't true. Amar lahu Ula. Ula said to everyone around him, really, hachi amar Rebbe Lazar, afilu miyasme. And why was it that he was avoiding saying this in front of Rav Nachman? Rav Nachman, of course, heard the water cooler talk. Amar Rav Nachman, ishtamtin Ula. Ula was trying to sneak away from me because he knew that I didn't hold of this shita, that if there was a yasom who had absorbed an Eved, that no one's allowed to collect from that. That was what he initially said. The halacha seems to be that that's what Rav Nachman holds. So Ula was just speaking to Rav Nachman the way that Rav Nachman wanted to be spoken to. Lamaisa, how do we hold? Let's say that I owe you money and I had an Eved, and my Eved was then given to one of my Yasomim, one of my children. So then the Gemara says, how do we paskin? Let's see. Hava Uvdu b'Naharda. This actually took place in Naharda, where a man had an Eved, and then when that man passed away, the Eved went to the Yasomim, and the Agbu Daine de Naharda, they were able to collect from the Yasomim. And similarly, that was in Naharda as well, Hava Uvda b'Pumpedisa ve'agbe Rav Chana bar Bizna as well, that he also collected from an Eved that was in the possession of the Yasomim. So Amar Lahu Rav Nachman, Zilu Ahaduru, Rav Nachman, who didn't agree with this shita. Rav Nachman held that if an Eved is passed from a father to a Yasom, that a Balchov is not allowed to collect that Eved, who is now in the possession of the Yasomim. He said, Zilu Ahaduru, you need to go back and give back. That's not the way we collect things. He held that it wasn't right. V'ilo, and if you don't, Magbina L'chula Abhad Naichu. And if not, I'm going to put a lien on your property. I'm going to take your mansions from it and take your houses. This is not the way we collect. We are not allowed, as a Balchov, we're not allowed to collect from an Eved that a Yasom inherited from his father. That's not allowed. So the Gemara is a little bit perturbed by this idea, by Rav Nachman's shita, because Amar le Rava le Rav Nachman. Rava says to Rav Nachman, I just don't understand. Ha-Ula, you have the shita of Ula, ha-Rebbe Lazar, and as well Rebbe Lazar. And you have as well ha-Daine de Naharda and a Pumpedisa. The Gemara leaves out Pumpedisa. Reb Chana bar Bizna. We have all of these shitas that say that yes, if an Eved is bequeathed to a Yasom after the death of a father, that a Balei Chov are allowed to collect from that. You, Rav Nachman, why are you being so stark? There's so many Mari Mekomos, there's so many Rabbanim Chashuvim who hold that a Balei Chov is allowed to collect from an Eved that was bequeathed to a child. Mara Keman Svirale. Who then do you, Rav Nachman, hold like? So Rav Nachman says, it's really great that you have all of these Amoraim, but I have a Mari Makom from Mishnayos that tells me that I'm right. And we are about 10 lines down, says the Gemara, Amar le ana masnisa yodana. I know a Mishnah. Tatani Avimi, we learn the Mishnah from Avimi. This Mishnah is about Pruzbal. We're going to be learning a couple of Brisas now about Pruzbal, Mishnayos and Brisas. I'm just going to tell you right now, they're difficult Mishnayos. We're going to be learning them on the surface. We don't have time to dig into the sugyas. If you sit here just for a few minutes, we don't have time now, but if you'd sit with the Rashis for a bit, you'd be able to figure out every line. We're just going to glean from the top of the surface. The Gemara says in the name of Avimi, this Brisa reads Pruzbal, Chal al hakarka, ve'enu chal al ha'avadim. When we write a Pruzbal, and as we know, a Pruzbal prevents the dissolving of a shtar, the dissolving of a loan through the Shemitah year. That only applies to karka, ve'en chal al avadim. It doesn't apply to avadim. Metaltal and niknin im hakarka. In regards to karka, when it is purchased, can also help to acquire any metaltalin that's there as well. If you buy a house with all of the lawn furniture, you get the lawn furniture too. Ve'eno niknin im ha'avadim. And over here we see that they're not niknim im ha'avadim, which means that avadim are not like karka. This is where Rav Nachman gets his shita from. that avadim are not like karka. Masha ein kain, when it came to the shitas of the previous Amoraim, that we assume that the avadim could transfer over father to son, that the avadim could transfer like land. Rav Nachman says that that's not the case, and that's why Rav Nachman was stark against these Amoraim. Says the Gemara, if that's true, that really Rav Nachman does have a Mari Makom in the Tanaim, so then perhaps, says the Gemara, a third of the way down, Lema Kitanai, perhaps we actually have a Machlokes Tanaim on this matter. And just to broaden what we're discussing, we were discussing really a local issue of whether or not we can assume that if an Eved was bequeathed to a Yasom, if a Baal Chov can collect from that Eved. So the Gemara here is just going to broaden it. Do we say that an Eved is like Karka? Or do we say that an Eved is like Metaltalin? And here is a Brisa. The Brisa says, Machar lo avadim ve'karkos. Let's say that a man sells two things. He sells avadim and karkos. Hechzik be'avadim. If that when I'm picking this up to make a chazak, I'm machzik be'avadim lo kana karkos. We see clearly already that an Eved and karka are not the same. And be'karkos lo kana avadim. And as well, if I pick up the karka, if I make my kinyan on the karka, then that's not sufficient to make a kinyan on the avadim. And the Brisa continues. Karkos and metaltalin. Let's say that I'm purchasing ground, I'm purchasing earth and properties, physical movable objects. Hechzik be'karka. If I make my kinyan on karka, kana metaltalin, the metaltalin lo kana karka. So if I make the kinyan on the karka, then I absorb anything that's on that karka, namely all of the movable objects. And if I make my kinyan with the metaltalin, so then lo kana karka. And the third case of this brisa is as follows: avadim u'metaltalin. Let's say that I was purchasing slaves and movable objects. Hechzik be'avadim lo kana metaltalin. Be'metaltalin lo kana avadim. You cannot cross-purchase when you're buying these two things. Avadim and metaltalin are not the same. Now, in the first case of this Mishnah, what did we see? We saw that avadim and karka are not synonymous with one another halachically in regards to kinyanim. So that is a beautiful Mari Makom that supports this shita that we saw in the Gemara. That we have this shita that karka and avadim are not the same. V'hatanya, we have a brisa that qualifies the brisa we just saw and says that hechzik ba'avadim kana metaltalin. No, we see that there is a shita that if you are going to make a kinyan with the avadim, then you are going to be kona the metaltalin. So says the Gemara, my lab b'hakamiflagi. Doesn't that mean that this really is the machlokes? That demar savar avadim kimikarka dami, that really one shita holds that avadim are like karka. Those are all of the Amoraim that we started with Ula, and with Rabbi Lazar, and with Rabbi Chana Bar Bizna, and with the Bezdin of Nahardan, the Bezdin of Pumpadisa, all the Mari Makom, which is at the top of the page, they hold that avadim are like karka. Umar savar, and the last brisa holds, the earlier brisa holds that avadim is kimetaltalin dami. Beautiful. So maybe we really just have a machlokes Tanaim that's showing its head in the Amoraim. You have Rav Nachman on the one side and all the other Amoraim on the other. Amen. So maybe this is our machlokes. So says the Gemara, it's not true. And there are two versions of the answers that we're about to see. Here's version number one. And then in about 8 lines or so, we'll see an Ika de Amre. So here is version number one. Amar of Ika Berei Derav Ami. Dekule Alma Avadim Kimikarka Edami. Everybody holds that Avadim are like Karka, and Avadim are not like Metaltalin. This is the Shita of Ula. V'hadatanya Kana. When the Brisa says that it's Kana, that the Eved can be Kana, that makes sense because Eved and Karka are the same Shapir. V'hadatanya, but the other Brisa that says Lo Kana, Bo'inan Karka, Dumya de Arem Mitsuros B'Yehuda. We need Karka in this case when we're talking about making a kinyan with avadim and with karka. We need the type of avadim that are like karka, which is Arim Mitzuros B'Yehuda, which is a pasuk, namely with karka that's not movable. Karka that's not movable is terra firma. An eved that has the status of karka is still not exactly the same as karka, even though there may be some halachic aspects of an eved that are like karka, but not in full. That's just not the case. So therefore, the Gemara says we need them to be dumya de aram mitzuras bihuda de lo naidi, where there's no movement. Ditnan. Where do we have this idea that karka has to be immovable to make a kinyan like the ones of this brisa? Because the brisa, the Mishnah says This is a Mishnah that we have seen in Maseches Kedushin. We're 2/3 of the way down on Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Nechasim she'ein lehem achrayis, properties that don't have a lien on them, namely movable objects, niknim, they can be purchased with im nechasim sheyesh tam achrayis bekesef b'shtar v'chazaka. What this Mishnah means is that if I'm buying a property, and they say, yeah, you're buying the property and anything that's on it. And on it happens to be a tractor, and there happens to be tools in the garage, and there happens to be furniture in the house. So the din is based on this Mishnah in Kedushin that halacha l'maisa, we know that the metaltalin are nikne along with the karka. And where do we know this idea from? Minohani mili. Amar Chizkiya de Amar Kra. The pasuk says, "Vayiten hamavi and matanos rabos lekesef ulezav ulemigdanos im are mitzuros biYehuda." You can buy all of these things: the presents, rabos, the money, the gold, the migdanos, all the treats. You can buy all of them, but only with im are mitzuros biYehuda. So this is answer number one. That really the machlokes that we thought was true in the Tanoim is not really the case, and really version number one of Rav Ika Bereder of Ami is that really avodim are like karka, and we explain away the brisa that's complicated. But 10 lines or so from the bottom, the Gemara says Ika de Amre. Really, there's another version of this to solve for our question. We wanted to know, when we talk about avodim and karka and whether or not they are the same as one another, do we equate them fully or do we not? We tried one approach to explain why there's no machlokes, and here is the equal and opposite approach. Amar Avika Bereder Rav Idi. This is interesting. This is a different name as listed before. Before it was Rav Ika Bereder Rav Ami. So that's why you'll find over here that the name is actually changed to Ami. David, you have this in yours also? Mm-hmm. So this was in the Hagos V'Tzionim, in the Kisvei Yad. It is in fact Ami, but we're used to seeing Rav Idi. Rav Ika Bereder Rav Idi it's a common name in Shas. This was a little bit different. Is it a different person? For sure, the Ami and Idi are different. But even if the first person, who was Rav Ika, was it the same person or not? I don't know, but I presume it is. So what is answer number two? Do we in fact have a machlokas between Tanoim about whether or not avodim are like karka? Says the Gemara, no, we do not. The kule alma avde kimetaltalin dami. Really, avodim are like metaltalin. And therefore, because an eved is like metaltalin, in order to be kona, that eved, you have to make a specific kinyan, and therefore lo kana shapir, that makes sense. What about the other brisa, the Tanya kana? That is be'odan alav. When do we say that an eved can be kona, that which is metaltalin? Only when the metaltalin, when he's wearing it, he's got a backpack on with a bunch of stuff, that works. Asks the Gemara, no, that should not work at all, because v'chi odan alav ma'have, even if the eved has a backpack on it with metaltalin, it still shouldn't create any kinyanim. After all, chatzer mahalechasi. The din of an eved who's walking, the din of a person who's walking is like a chatzer that's mahaleches, a portable chatzer. And as we've learned already a number of times in Shas, the chatzer mahaleches lo kana. So therefore, we cannot say that the case that we're dealing with is where an eved is holding metaltalin on him. And the Gemara interjects and says, and even if you want to say be'omed, that the eved is really just standing still and he's not moving, so he's not mehaleches anymore, that's a bad argument. Because v'ha'amar, we learned in Maseches Gittin in a couple of places, v'ha'amar, we already said, v'ha'amar Rava, kol she'ilu mahalech lo kana, that if while you're walking you're not going to be kona, then omed v'yoshev is also lo kana. You're still begeder chetzer mahaleches, even if you're standing still, because you could walk, which makes you ineligible to make a kinyan, which means that we can't answer up the stira in Brisas by saying be'odan alav that the eved is holding metaltalin on his body. So says the Gemara, how do we answer this? The way we can explain this is as if the eved is tied down. If the eved is tied down, so then the din is that he is no longer in the category of a chetzer mahalechasi, because he doesn't have the choice to move. He's got handcuffs on. He's not going anywhere. So that's how we could create a scenario where an eved can create metaltalin, where an eved can be kona, where a person can be kona metaltalin by buying an eved. If I buy an eved and he has a backpack of stuff on him and that Eved is kafus, he's tied down, he's got handcuffs on, then you're 100% right. And that's the case of that brisa, which is why there's no stira. So version number one of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami was that really behold avodim are like karka. Version number two is that really we hold that avodim are like metaltalin. And as you can see from the Rambam's notations here, it seems that we hold like the second shita, that an Eved is in the category of metaltalin. We have a brisa hechzik bekarka kana avodim. How can you say that? We have a brisa that says that we have karka, and the karka, if you're hechzik the karka, then you're nikna de avodim. But according to the second shita that we just saw, that avodim are metaltalin, how does this brisa make sense? This brisa seems to show that an eved and karka are one and the same. But the second version of Rav Ika Bered Rav Ami indicated that no, that avodim are metaltalin. So which one is it? Is it that avodim are metaltalin, or hechzik bekarka kana avodim, and really karka and eved are the same? Says the Gemara, no. Really, we're holding stark, that we still hold that avodim are like metaltalin, but hasam, what is that case over there where it says that if you're machzik the karka, then you're kona the avodim? That's be'omdin besocha. That's where the eved is standing inside the field. If the eved is standing inside the field, and I make a kinyan in such a way where I can acquire the karka, then by definition, I also acquire the eved. But more because he functions as metaltalin than because he functions as karka. And in the same way, that had I had some metaltalin on that property and I was kona the property, I would be kona the metaltalin. The same thing is true with an eved. If there's an eved on the property and I'm kona the karka, I'm also kona the eved. Says the Gemara Michlal, we're 5 lines from the bottom on Yud Beis Mid Aleph. This implies Dahai lo kana keshe'ein omdin besocha. It seems to be that when there is no kinyan, it must be where the eved is not there. That's a very difficult thing to say, because as the Gemara highlights, I could understand that this is true according to the second version to Amar of Ika, Bereda Rav Ami, that Avde Kimatal Dami. I understand why you'd say that if the Eved is in the property, he's like metaltalin, so he's kona with the purchase of the karka. And if the Eved is not on the karka, he won't be included in the purchase. Hainu, di omdin besocha in ilolo. That makes perfect sense. So this Gemara seems to bring a raya for the second approach. Ella, 3 lines from the bottom. But according to the first version of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami, this doesn't work. Lamali omdin besocha. That shouldn't help at all. Says the Gemara, after all, Ha'amar Shmuel, Machar lo eser sados be'eser medinos, kevan shehechzik be'achas man, kana kulan. It shouldn't make a difference if the Eved is standing in the field or not, because Shmuel taught us a halacha, also a halacha that we learned in the previous Masechta and Kedushin, that if I buy 10 fields, then once I'm being kona one of them, I should be kona all of them. So if it were to be that approach number 1 of the Gemara of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami was correct, that an Eved is karka, then mimanavshach, whether or not the Eved stood on the karka doesn't matter. Because if I buy 10 distinct pieces of property, once I make a kinyan on one, I make a kinyan on the other 9. And obviously the karka that's down the block is not on top of the karka that I just bought. So if really answer number 1 of the Gemara of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami is true, who cares if he's on the property or not? Says the Gemara, according to your logic, according to the shita that says that avodim are like metaltalin, lama li omdin besocha. Why then would I need the Eved to be standing on the property? As we turn to the top of Yud Beis, Amud Beis, we'll be going to the top of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, Hakaim Alon, Deloba Inon Siburin. We actually hold another Gemara in Kedushin that we don't need tzibur, we don't need them to be piled on in order for them to be nikneh. How then does the Gemara make a proper distinction? The Gemara says, "Shiny metaltale denaidi mi metaltale delo naidi." There's a difference between metaltalin that are portable and metaltalin that are less portable. Hachanami here too. Shiny mikarkai denaidi mi mikarkai delo naidi. There's also a difference between karka that's movable and karka that's not. Avda mikarkae denaidihu. When we talk about an Eved, even if you want to say that the first approach of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami is real and right, that an Eved is karka, okay, but he's still Avda mikarkae denaidihu. But hasam sadna de'arachadhu. But over there in the case in the Mishnah where we said that if a man purchased 10 pieces of property, that he can be kona all of them by making one transaction on one property, but that all of the world is sadna da'ara, all the earth is connected to one another. All of the world is connected to one another somehow. Again, all the way at the core of the earth. How deep is it before it's all land again? I don't know. But the Gemara said, we learned this in the previous Masechta also, that it's sadna de'ara, chadu, that everything is connected. So we've made a bunch of distinctions here. Let me just summarize quickly so that we have it clear. The Gemara struggles to understand whether or not an eved is in the category of karka, or if an eved is in the category of metaltalin, and all of the nafkaminas that you could imagine. Can you purchase an eved with karka? Can you not? We'll use that as the one nafkamina for today. And the Gemara goes through two versions, and each version has to solve for the Mari Mekomos that don't make sense. Version number 1 of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami is that avadim are like karka. Version number 2 of Rav Ika Bereda Rav Ami is that avadim are like metaltalin. And the Gemara does go back and forth, and while the Gemara itself doesn't seem conclusive, it does seem to be that the Rambam holds that an eved is considered like metaltalin. Good. Yud Beis and Mid Beis, 5-6 lines down. That brings us to the next 2 dots. Our Mishnah had said a couple of blot ago that when is it that we say that the halachos of our Mishnah apply? That's only true when there's no din of me'ilah. Now, just to review, that our Mishnah is on Testament Beis, and that Mishnah had taught us that if hechsharti b'mixas nizko, if I was partially responsible for damage that happened, then chavti b'tashlume nizko kehechshar kol nizko, then I got to pay the bills. And the Gemara said, when is this true? It's only true by nechasim she'ein bahem me'ilah. Let's analyze this piece of Gemara. The Gemara says that it's only true that these rules don't apply by me'ilah hu delesbehu. That's only true if an item doesn't have me'ilah. But if an item doesn't have me'ilah, but ha-mekadesh kadshi, but in fact it is subject to some aspects of kedusha, so then the rules would be different, and the rules would change from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that the rules don't apply by me'ilah. The implication is that they would apply by kachim. Who is the author of such a shita, that the rules of our Mishnah, that if I'm obligated to pay in part, I'm obligated to pay in full, that they would apply by kachim, if not by me'ilah? Mantana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bekachim Kalim, Ve'aliba de Rabbi Yossi Haglili. We're talking about Kachim Kalim, and we're holding within the world of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. What does Rabbi Yossi Haglili hold? Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds, and we learned about this in a previous Gemara as well, to Amar Mamon Bailimhu. Rabbi Yossi Haglili was of the opinion that Kachim Kalim belong to the Bailim. Very unique. Yes, you're giving it, you were already Mekadesh it, but there's still some bilas that I, as the owner, still hold on to. Detanya. The Brisa writes, the Pasuk says, Umal amal ba'Hashem, l'rabos kachim kalim shehein mamono divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Yossi Haglili is of the opinion that kachim still maintain some aspect of bilas, of mamon bailim. And therefore, the Gemara says it must be in our Mishnah that's why this makes sense. Our Mishnah said that if something is subject to me'ilah, the rules of payment don't apply. However, if they were kachim without me'ilah, the rules of payments would apply. Why? Because they're mamon bailim. Whose shita is that? Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Wait 1 second. Rabbi Yossi Haglili's shita is a bit of a challenge. We're a third of the way down in Yud Beis and Mid Beis. The Gemara says, "V'atznan." We have a Mishnah. Hamekadesh bechelko, a person who is mekadesh something. Bein bekadshe kachim, bein bekachim kalim ein mekudeshes. The Gemara says that if a kohen wants to get married with his portion, whether or not his portion is kachim kalim or kachim, he's not married. Now, this is a stira to Rabbi Yossi Haglili. If Rabbi Yossi Haglili was right, that there's still mamon bailim by kachim kalim, then that should be a kedushin. If I, as a kohen, get my portion of a kachim kalim, and I bring it over to a woman and say, Harat mekudeshes li bekachim kalim zu kedas Moshe Yisrael. If Rabbi Yossi Haglili is right, they should be married. But this Mishnah says that they're not married. So therefore, the Gemara says, Lema delok Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Perhaps that din of mekadesh bechelko, that a man who proposes with kachim kalim is not married, must not be like Rabbi Yossi. Says the Gemara, not correct. Afilu tema Rabbi Yossi Haglili, we're halfway down Yud Beis Mid Beis. Ki Amar Rabbi Yossi Haglili mechayim. When is it that Rabbi Yossi Haglili says that there's mamon bailim, there's a status of mamon bailim when it comes to kachim kalim, and in fact, a woman would be married if a man gave his portion to her b'toras kedushin? That's true if the animal's still alive. However, aval le'achar shchita, but once that animal has been shechted by the kohen, remember the 4 steps of a korban is we have all the various steps. We have shchita, we have kabbalas adam, we have halacha and zrika. The second the shchita is done, Even Rabbi Yossi Aglili agrees that there's no longer a status of Mamon Bailim. The only time Kodshe Kodshim have a status of Mamon Bailim is before the Shechita. But even Rabbi Yossi would agree, these Modeh Dechi Kazachu, that when the Kohanim got their Chelek after the animal was shechted, Mishulchan Gvoa Kazachu. They are of the opinion, all of them, even Rabbi Yossi Aglili is of the opinion that if a Kohen gets his portion of Kodshim Kalim after an animal is shechted, everyone agrees it's Shulchan Gavoa and there's no din of Mamon Bailim. So as of right now, there's no machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and anyone. Rabbi Yossi Aglili was saying that Mechayim, when an animal's still alive, it could be that there's Mamon Bailim, a status of Mamon Bailim by Kodshim. That's not true when an animal dies. And the Gemara pushes even on our understanding of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. 2/3 of the way down. Umechayim Omar. Even if the animal's alive, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you're still going to say that there's a status of Mamon Bailim by Kodshim Kalim. How can you say that? Says the Gemara, we have a Mishnah in regards to an animal that's a Bechor, a difficult Mishnah. We're not going to learn it too deep right now. This is a Mishnah in Meiser Sheni. Bechor mochrin oso tam chai. A Bechor, an animal that's a Bechor, can be sold from one Kohen to another if it's tam, if it has no mum, and if the animal's alive. Ubal mum, if an animal is sold when it has a balmum, that's chai, v'shachut, it can be sold alive, and it can also be sold shechted, umekadshin bo es ha'isha, and there is some aspect of kedushin. So that means that with an animal that's a balmum, because it can no longer be a bechor, because it's a balmum, so therefore there's an aspect of kedushin there. This is only true by a bechor in today's post-Churban era. To kevan delo chazi lehakrava, since that animal is not fit for hakrava, isluhu lekohanim zuchia begavayu. Therefore, because it's not shaykh to the Beis Hamikdash, because there is no Beis Hamikdash, then we have a din of Mamon Bailim. There's a schus on the side of the kohanim. However, aval bisman shebeis Hamikdash kayam dechazi lehakrava lo. But had it been that even if the animal was alive, but it was, but because it's chazi lehakrava in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, there is no Mamon Bailim. And that's a big kasha on Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Because here we see that even when the animal's alive, if it's Bizman Shebeis Hamikdash Hayakayim, there's never Mamon Bailim. That's a kasha on Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Let's finish articulating the question. Ve'esve Rava l'Rav Nachman, u'mal amal ba'Hashem, l'Rabos Kodshim Kalim she'Mamono, div Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So here's our stira. The Mishnah that we just learned from Meiser Sheni teaches us that Mechayim, even Mechayim, that there's no din of Mamon Bailim when the Beis HaMikdash is around. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili seems to say that that's not true, that from the Pasuk, U'mal amal ba'Hashem, that teaches us that there is a status of Mamon Bailim even by Kodshim Kalim. Stira? Says the Gemara, Umeshani Ravina, Bibechor bechutz la'aretz ve'aliba de Reb Shimon. Very creative answer. The Gemara says, it is Bizman Shebeis HaMikdash Hayakayim. But we're not talking about inside Eretz Yisrael. What Rabbi Yossi Aglili is talking about when he says that an animal mechayim has a din of Mamon Bailim, that an animal that's Kodshei Kodshim has a din of Mamon Bailim, that's with an animal that's a Bechor and Chutz La'aretz. To Amar, he says, Im ba'u timimchem, if you bring your whole animals, yikrivu. If you bring your animals to Eretz Yisrael, we can shech them. What's the din? Im bahu in. If you brought them, yes. The language of if is always a language of b'di'eved. L'chadchila lo. But you really should not. Namely, if your animal is stuck in chutz la'aretz, which is what you should do with your animal when it's in chutz la'aretz, don't bring this animal lehakrava. There, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says it's kodshei kalim, and therefore the kodshim kalim have a din of mamon bailim. Says the Gemara. V'im isa dechi amar Rabbi Yossi Aglili mamono hu mechayim. If you want to say that really, that according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and he says that there's a din of mamon bailim only when the animal is alive, then Lishni, we should have given a different answer. Rashi says Ravina should have given a different answer. Ha Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Ha Rabbanan. That the two Brisas have a different answer. Why did you go the extra mile, Ravina, to give this answer of Bechor B'chutz La'aretz? Perhaps there's a machlokes between these Tanaim over here. Why didn't you say that? Amar lei matna kahuna ka'amris. You can't say this about matnas kahuna. There is no machlokas about matnas kahuna because shiny matnas kahuna dechi kazachu mishulchan kavoa kazachu. We're dealing with a different category over here, one that's not shaykh to a machlokas Rabbi Yossi Aglili. everybody agrees in regards to matnas kahuna that once they are shechted, that the kazachu mishulchan gavoa kazachu, and everyone agrees to that. So there's no machlokes about the status of kachim, that when they're alive, there is a status of mamon. When they're not alive, there is no status of mamon. And that's why we didn't answer with a distinction between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the Rabbanon, but rather Ravina answered saying that the case we're talking about is a bechor that's in Chutz La'aretz. We'll stop right here. Emir Tashem, tomorrow night we'll pick up on the fourth line of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Wishing you all a beautiful night.